Hello everyone, it is Victor here, and this is a very brief introduction to personal finance. In this video, I'm going to lay out a framework for understanding personal finance. Please go ahead and like and subscribe. Let's start by talking about the goal of personal finance. Simply put, the goal of personal finance is to have enough money to do whatever you want to do. Now, I would like to emphasize that it is to have enough money, not to have all the money, but just to have enough for whatever it is you want to do. And I also want to emphasize that it's to do whatever you want to do, not what someone else wants to do, not what society values. It's to do whatever you want to do. A lot of times, the most common things that people talk about when they talk about personal finance and investing and saving is quitting their job, retiring early, traveling the world, having all these luxuries. But those are not the only options. You may be more interested in personal finance in order to be able to support those you love, to provide elder care for your parents or grandparents, to provide an education for your children or grandchildren. You may be more interested in philanthropy and think that there are a lot of good organizations out there that do a lot of good work that you truly believe in and want to be able to contribute substantially in a financial way to those organizations. Altruism, philanthropy are very, very good reasons to want to up your personal finance game. It's important to recognize that what you value does not need to be the same as what other people value. So whether you value your own leisure or your own pleasure or your family or philanthropy or something else, that is perfectly okay. With that, let's talk about the framework through which we can understand personal finance. And we're going to do that through the money-mass balance. Now, I'm a chemical engineer, and in chemical engineering, we have this nifty little equation called the mass balance that describes reactive chemical systems. It goes something like this: in minus out plus generation minus consumption equals accumulation. Now, I think this equation is actually very, very helpful for understanding personal finance. If we simply equate each one of those terms to something that means something to the rest of the world in terms of money. Simply put, in is your income. That is the money that you make by going to work and spending time doing something that someone else is paying you to do. Out is your expenses. This is money that you spend in order to be able to continue living the way you live, whether you are renting an apartment or paying a mortgage on a house, or buying food or clothing, whatever that may be. It's money that you are spending and that you have control over spending. Note that while not all expenses are discretionary, they are all voluntary. They are all expenses where you are actively putting money towards something. Generation is any money that you make from your investments, and consumption is any money that you lose on investments. Finally, the accumulation term really just equates to your wealth. Ultimately, the goal here is to make the accumulation term as big as possible, as big as you need it to be. Again, we're going for enough, not everything. Now, this equation can be broken down into two parts. The in minus out part of the equation we are going to call budgeting. The gen minus consumption part of the equation we are going to call investing. When beginning with personal finance, people should start with the budgeting part of the equation, because you can't really invest if you don't have money to invest, and you don't have money to invest unless you budget. So we are starting with the budgeting part of the equation for anyone that is new to the personal finance game. Note that the accumulation term can be expressed as the sum of the accumulation from budgeting and the accumulation from investing. So we can really kind of look at the ways to optimize the accumulation from budgeting and also ways to optimize the accumulation from investing, and those techniques will be different. Let's start with the budgeting part of the equation. The budgeting part of the equation goes something like in minus out equals accumulation due to budgeting. This should be pretty obvious, but you want to try to maximize the income part of that equation, and you want to try to minimize the expenses part of that equation. And in doing so, you're going to make your accumulation due to budgeting number as big as possible. Things you can consider in the in term include salary, including commissions, part-time jobs, side hustles, that sort of thing. And the more income sources we have, or the higher that those income sources are, the bigger our in term is going to be, obviously. The more money you make, the more money you theoretically have to play with, right? The out term, or our expenses, can be described by housing expenses, utilities, transportation, food, clothes, entertainment, luxuries, leisure, miscellaneous things, and all of those things that we spend money on go into this out term. So by having as large of an income as possible and by having as little expense as possible, we optimize our accumulation term and give ourselves the most money to invest that we can. When you invest money, you get some kind of return on that investment. That return can either be positive, expressed as a gain, or negative, expressed as a loss. So here, we are trying to maximize our gains, the generation term, and we're trying to minimize our losses, which is the consumption term. That is theoretically going to make our accumulation term as big as possible. Talking about ways to generate gains, we're going to talk about different types of investments like mutual funds, ETFs, individual stocks, bonds, real estate. We're going to talk a lot about ROI, which is return on investment, and the different types of investments you can make and what that return on investment is and how much it is worth it compared to the risk. Speaking of risk, we are trying to minimize our losses, which means we are trying to mitigate risk involved in our investments. So we'll talk about things like choosing investments, volatility, long-term versus short-term, namely the buy and hold strategy, and other things like this. Overall, whatever money you make in investments, whatever that accumulation term due to investment is, that is called passive income. That is income that you did not have to actively work for with some employer paying you for a number of hours that you showed up to work. Overall, personal finance can be broken down into two categories: budgeting and investing. When talking about budgeting, we are concerned with increasing our income and decreasing our expenses. When talking about investing, we are concerned with increasing our gains and decreasing our losses. A large majority of personal finance advice can be boiled down into being advice for one of these four different categories. So understanding which category that advice is for and which category you're thinking about and operating in is really important to be able to maximize that advice. With that, thank you very much for watching. Please consider liking and subscribing, and until next time.